Hello and welcome to another health talk. Today we're going to be talking about fats, sugars, and insulin. And that's leading up to what? You guessed it, diabetes. So, now you may be thinking, Glenn, you're not a doctor, you're not a scientist. What the F do you know about diabetes? You don't even have diabetes. No, I don't. You're right. However, I have some experience vicariously from having friends with diabetes. In addition, I learned some important facts from some interviews that I saw of Cyrus Kambata, PhD, and his business partner Dr. Robbie Barbaro, MPH, and they, primarily Cyrus, explained how we get insulin resistance, and that leads to diabetes. So I want to try and explain it to you. Now, in the videos, or the particular interview that I saw where Cyrus explained this, which was with the YouTuber and ultramarathoner Rich Roll, he didn't use any visuals. So I'm going to try to break this down in a more visual way with my really excellent artistic skills that you're going to be so impressed by. Okay? So, first of all, you got to understand that our macronutrients come in three types. There are the proteins, there are the fats, and there are the carbs. Now, proteins originate from plants, and animals eat those plants and thus get the protein. We can't synthesize protein out of nothing. We have to have it from sources. Now, if we get it from animals, we can also get it that way. However, our bodies are not as good at acquiring protein from meat. It can be problematic, and it can actually cause inflammatory responses in our body. Now, setting aside the protein, there's just the fat and the carbs. And I've talked previously about carbohydrates. I haven't really talked a lot about fats, but basically there's the saturated and the trans fats, which are really bad for you. And then there are the unsaturated, the mono and polyunsaturated, and those are good for you. And so you want to have a diet that's limited in fats, and but not the good fats necessarily, although you do want to get them in the right ratios. And you don't want to go overboard on them because your body only needs so much in order to be able to synthesize the other ones that we can't readily get from food, but that our body needs, which are called essential amino acids. Now, there are other amino acids, the omega-9s, which we don't actually need and we can synthesize as well. So when you eat fat, the digestive system turns it into lipids, and that is how fat is stored in the body. It's stored as lipids in the cells, specific cells of your body. Sugars, when you get them, if it's like a oligofructose or galactose or something like that, it'll be broken down into simpler things like lactose and sucrose. Lactose and sucrose can also be broken down into the basic building blocks of sugars, which are fructose and glucose. Now, how our body deals with those two things is different, but basically it gets broken down into glycogen. Now, fructose gets stored in the liver. I'm going to show you my lovely drawing now. Try to anyways. Oh boy, this is just such artistic genius. I am just so thoroughly impressed with myself. Okay, so as I was saying, we have the fats, and they get converted by the digestive system into lipids. Here, I'll turn it that way so you can see it, even if I can't really read it correctly. And here, I'll just move that like that for a minute. Okay, so the fats get turned into lipids. On the other hand, we have the sugars, the more complex ones, lactose and sucrose, have to be broken down, and they get converted into glucose and fructose. If you buy regular white sugar, that is a sucrose, so you're getting glucose and fructose. The glucose goes into the bloodstream, it goes to the brain, and I forgot to draw a head up here, but it, excuse me. And glucose is the main source of energy for the brain. It's extremely important that you have glucose in your blood, because if you don't have enough glucose in your blood, your brain will not function correctly. And here, let me just add to this amazing bit of art here by drawing briefly a person's head, and here's the brain part right there, right? So that's absolutely amazing, right? I know you're thoroughly impressed. All right. So when the glucose is transported through the heart and the arteries and veins, it goes up into the brain to provide energy there. But it also is a major source of energy for the rest of the body. All cells need glucose, pretty much. And then there's the fructose. Now, fructose is dealt with a little bit differently. It gets sent over to the liver, and it can be stored in the liver for later use as a source of energy. Now, but basically these two things get broken down into glycogen. And when it comes to glucose, it gets stored in two primary locations. It'll be stored in the fat, like your belly fat, which is the worst kind of fat to happen. You can actually have internal fat within the abdominal cavity here, and that fat actually puts pressure on your internal organs and creates a lot of havoc. If it's just external fat, it's not good, but it's not as bad by any means as the fat that's inside of your abdominal cavity. You can also get fat on the sides. You can get fat on the hips, on the thighs, and so on and so forth. But basically, these lipids get stored in this area as where there's fat, and the glucose goes to the skeletal muscles, and it also goes. Okay, so basically, the sugar gets stored in the liver and in the skeletal muscles as a source of energy, and the lipids get stored in fat and in the liver as well. So you can actually, if you have a high fat diet, you can actually develop what's called fatty liver, and that is bad for you because it means there's an excessive amount of fat in the liver, and it can affect the functioning of the liver and lead to cirrhosis of the liver, which is a really bad thing to have. The good thing about the liver is if you heal yourself and you take care of your liver, it can replenish itself. It can fix itself and regrow itself. Now, as far as the fat is concerned, fat cells are a bit interesting. So, like, if you have a fat cell and you've got the nucleus and the mitochondria and stuff in here, when the lipids come to a fat cell, the fat cell will store as much as it can, and you would think, oh, the lipids have filled it up. Well, no, actually what happens in fat cells is the fat cells, as more lipids are brought in, the fat cell will make itself bigger and bigger. Now, I'm just representing it this way. It probably doesn't look exactly like this, but it can store a much larger amount of lipids than the original size of the cell by expanding itself. But eventually it gets to the point where it can't expand any further, and then it's a saturated cell. Now, if this cell happens to be in the liver or in the skeletal muscles, then you have a problem. Now, glucose goes to all the muscles, but fat only goes to certain kinds of muscles, like the skeletal muscles. So if you have glucose come along, like you've just had yourself a nice piece of cake or something like that, and glucose goes into the bloodstream and is traveling around, well, then the pancreas gets into action and it creates insulin. And the insulin starts to circulate through the circulatory system, and its job is to find all of the glycogen and put it into cells to either be used immediately as a source of energy or to be stored in those cells as a source of energy. Now, if the the insulin goes to the liver where there are saturated fat cells, or it goes to skeletal muscles where there are saturated fat cells. What ends up happening is because the cell is already fully saturated, the insulin cannot, quote unquote, open the doors to allow the insulin to go in. So it gets rejected by the cell because the cell is already completely full. And this is what you call insulin resistance. Basically, you could look at it this way. You're having a house party and the house is so full that literally nobody else can step into the house. So when the really important people come along, well, they can't get into the house and they end up leaving frustrated because they are pissed off or whatever, and you miss out on the opportunity of having these great people at your party. And that's basically what happens. Now, the problem is the pancreas reacts to glucose or glycogen in your bloodstream. And the longer it stays in there, the more the pancreas will produce insulin. And it'll keep on doing this, and eventually, because the insulin is unable to, quote unquote, open the doors of the cells that are full to store the glycogen, it'll get to the point where there's a very high amount of glucose or glycogen in the blood, and that is called a high blood sugar. And that results in you having various symptoms. It can cause you to have an altered personality. It can cause you to feel very, very energetic. It can make a lot of problems for you. And when you finally get that blood sugar under control, you have this drop, this very rapid drop, especially with simple sugars, and that can result in you crashing, and you feel like very tired, and you have trouble thinking, and so on and so forth. So that's low glucose. But insulin, in addition to having this problem of dealing with fully loaded fat cells, also has a secondary task that when there is fat in the blood as well, which you would definitely get if, for example, you're eating something with saturated fat or trans fats like meat or dairy or eggs, insulin will trigger the production of what's called lipoprotein lipase. And lipoprotein lipase's job is to store fat. Okay, so now you're wondering, well, what does all this have to do with diabetes? Well, if you keep on having these incidences where your blood glucose keeps on spiking over and over and over again, your pancreas cells that are responsible for making the insulin, or which are called beta cells, kind of get tired and worn out, and they are no longer able to keep up with the demand for insulin that your body needs because of this complex problem of too much fat in the cells and the glucose being rejected in the insulin resistance scenario. Now, if this goes on for long enough, and it usually, I believe, takes years and years for this to happen, unless you're a type 1 diabetic. But if this goes on for long enough, you end up becoming pre-diabetic. And this can be checked out by looking at a marker, which is called the A1C. And the A1C is basically a long-term, it's a 3-month average of your blood glucose. And they can actually get that information out of you by just taking a sample of your blood when you're fasting. And there are other tests that can be done, like after you're done fasting, you have a meal, and then they can check your blood again. But most of the time, they just check the A1C. But there are other things that they can look at as well. When you get into a high enough level of A1Cs, you're pre-diabetic. And then if it goes even higher, it can become type 2 diabetes. And at this point, if you are not changing your diet, you're going to end up with a very long-term problem that you're going to have to take pills or maybe shots of insulin, metformin, whatever it is, in order to regulate your blood sugar. And if you're not actually paying attention to what you're eating, this becomes worse and worse and worse. And in fact, if you follow the dietary recommendations of the American Diabetes Association, which, and by the way, gets money from the pharmaceutical corporations, so they are not necessarily financially motivated by helping you so much as they are financially motivated by the pharmaceutical companies. And they promote types of food that provide lots of fat that cause the whole insulin resistance problem and thus the diabetes. Now, you may have heard of the keto diets, and keto diets were developed to treat people with epileptic seizures. They weren't developed for weight loss. It's also been discovered they do help with other neurological disorders, but short-term keto can help you to lose weight and to get your A1C, your blood glucose and all that stuff down, your blood pressure and a bunch of other things. However, within a year to 2 years, your numbers, which will only go down to prediabetes in most cases, will bounce back up to high prediabetes or even back into type 2 diabetes on a keto diet. Now, there are studies out there that show it, including studies by Virta Health, which is a company that promotes keto diets, and the studies were funded by Virta Health, as well as the food and beverage industries and the diet industries and the pharmaceutical industries. So it's completely biased. And the abstract's conclusions say, that the results were great and got people off of type 2 diabetes, but the facts, if you actually look at the facts themselves, demonstrate that they remained diabetic or pre-diabetic, and very few of them actually got off their medication and stopped being diabetics. Now, so the solution is you don't want to have a lot of fats in your diet. Now, you do need some fats in your diet, especially the unsaturated ones, and you also need cholesterol in your diet, although not a lot. But cholesterol is a requirement of your body, and you need the HDLs. You need to try and avoid the LDLs and the VLDLs, which are very LDLs. But ultimately, the most important thing is your complex carbohydrates, which are the best source of your sugars. So the complex carbohydrates are going to give you a slow release of the full amount of sugar that's in the food that you're eating, like grains and fresh fruits and vegetables and stuff like that. Whereas a simple sugar like honey, agave, and syrups and crystal sugars and ground sugars and stuff like that, any of those things, starches, the release will be faster. And in some cases, it will be these spikes, especially if it's these pure sugars. You'll get these sharp, high spikes that are very fast up and very fast down of your blood sugar, and that's what messes you up. So you want to limit your intake of fats, and you want to increase your intake of carbs, and make sure you have an adequate amount of proteins. Now, you don't have to get proteins from meat, and there are problems with getting proteins from meat aside from the fat issue, such as the amount of cholesterol you get from meats, as well as trans fats in the fat of meat, which is a naturally occurring phenomenon. And the B12 comes from bacteria. It doesn't come from animals. Animals just ingest it and then pass it on if you eat it. And animal B12 also is not the optimum source. It's harder for our bodies to digest. The best is the crystal form of the supplement B12, which is very, very cheap. But I hope now you have a better understanding of how this works. I know it's a little bit complicated, but the basic premise is fats come in, they fill up your cells with fat, and then when the glucose comes in, the insulin can't open up the cells to put the glucose in there because the cells are already full. And so they get rejected, and this over time leads to all these sugar spikes and ends up in type 2 diabetes. Now, the good news is if you go on a low-fat, high carb diet with adequate protein, and you don't need a ton of protein, and you can get all the proteins you need from plants because that's where protein naturally comes from, is you can actually go from being type 2 diabetes to pre-diabetics to non-diabetics by observing a diet of plant-based plant-based whole foods. Now, plant-based is pretty obvious, and whole foods is the opposite of processed foods, because the more processed a food is, the more likely it is to be bad for your health. And it's hard for the average consumer to look at a processed food, to look at the nutrition facts and say, oh, this is good for me or this is bad for me, because most people don't have enough of an understanding of what they're supposed to be looking at. And quite frankly, the food and beverage industries, including the sugar industry, dairy, eggs, meat, and so on, fast food industry, junk food industry, they're putting out a lot of deliberate misinformation. They're hiring third parties to spread misinformation. It took me months of research to be able to understand this and tell the difference between what's good and what's bad. So when you're looking at a nutrition fact thing, you should be looking, first of all, at total fats, and you should see a low number or no saturated fats and absolutely no trans fats. That's the first thing. If you see that half or more of the fats are saturated, that's a bad sign. You don't want to get too much saturated fat. You want to definitely keep it below that recommended 100%. So if 1.5 grams of fat is 8%, you want to keep this number low. But unfortunately, nutrition facts are not required to show unsaturated fats, but basically you subtract the total fats, you take the trans and the saturated fats and subtract those from total. That gives you the mono and polyunsaturated fats that are in there. The higher that number of unsaturated fats, the better it is. The lower the saturated fats and trans fats, the better it is. But again, always try to avoid trans fats. And remember, refined food oils do contain amounts of trans fats in them as well because of the refining process. So it's best to get extra virgin oil that's been cold pressed instead of processed with chemicals or processed with heat, which means that things like coconut oil and palm oil, which are processed with heat, are bad for you. Also, you should avoid soy oil and corn oil because we get too much corn and soy in our diets every day. They're in everything. And absolutely avoid dairy, eggs, meat, and excess salt and sugar. Then you should look at the cholesterol. Now, we do need some cholesterol in the diet every day, so you should try to make sure not to go over the daily limit. You can just kind of keep track every day, well, I ate this, so that was that much cholesterol, and this was no cholesterol, and then you just add up, and by the end of the day, you should have 100% or slightly less of the recommended daily allowance. And then sodium, you don't want to go over 2,300 milligrams per day, or that would be 2.3 grams. Now, if you are having problems with hypertension and you are basically sensitive to sodium and it contributes to hypertension, you might want to reduce that number even further. You do not want to go to 0 on sodium because your body requires sodium to function. Too little sodium, your body malfunctions. Now, so hopefully that's clear on this part here. The last part is the carbs. Now, there are 4 components to the carbs. The total carbohydrates, and when you're looking at a processed food, you're generally going to see high carbs or high fat, and worst of all, both. But when you look, if you see a dietary fiber listing, the higher that number is, the better. Dietary fiber is really good, and so you want to make sure to definitely include things that have dietary fiber in your diet. It also is going to make it easier for you to poop if you're having problems with hemorrhoids. It's going to help you to get rid of hemorrhoids if you're regularly consuming dietary fiber. You also want to take a look at total sugars and how much of that is added sugars. Now, if you're on a low-fat diet, again, the added sugars aren't going to be as important. But you don't want to go too crazy, especially if you are diabetic. And what I'm talking about here applies to diabetics and non-diabetics. It doesn't matter. These rules are the same. And you also want to keep a track of the protein that you're ingesting. There is very little evidence to show that you can get too little protein a day. Although there are dietary recommendations, and you can follow those dietary recommendations. But the consumption of protein, I've heard doctors say, I've never met somebody who was low on protein. B12, yes, but never protein. So, but you don't want to get a lot of protein. Now, here's another special rule. The higher the protein and the lower the carbs, the more it's going to impact your health. High protein is bad for you. High fat is bad for you. And the lower your carbs go, the worse it is. So you want to find low fat, adequate protein, and fairly high carbohydrates. And you'll want to talk to a professional. Now, please keep in mind, again, I'm not a medical professional. A lot of medical professionals receive little or no nutritional training. I am very fortunate that my family medical doctor is well trained in nutrition and could answer all my questions, and she verified for me all this information and all what I'm talking about here. And I also have another friend who is a retired doctor. She has decades of experience, and she's also very well versed in nutrition facts, and she also confirmed all this stuff for me as well. And there are lots of good doctors online who are sharing this kind of information. I'm just trying to help everybody to better understand what they can do to improve their health. Try to avoid fast food and junk food as much as possible. Now, these are hyper-processed foods that are designed to addict you. They're designed to take choice away from you, because when you are addicted, you can't stop yourself, especially if you are predisposed to addiction. And so you want to get away from the processed foods, get back to the whole foods, which are the opposite of processed foods. Get those green leafy vegetables, get the fruits, get less of the starchy vegetables, get legumes, and then limited amounts of nuts and seeds and virgin oils, like primarily olive and canola. And maybe some sunflower, some other ones. But try to stay away from the coconut oil, the palm oil, because they are high in saturated fats. Also stay away from coconut milk and cream, because that's high in saturated fats. And stay away from soy oil and corn oil, simply because we get way too much of that in our diets anyways, because these products are subsidized heavily by the government, and thus they're used in everything, pretty much. So, if you have any questions, please leave comments down below. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit through this and watch this. I really hope it made sense, but if it didn't make sense, let me know. I'll try to clarify things for you. Thank you again so much, and I hope you have a wonderful day and better health to you. Stay healthy.